Congress.
Congress.
Congress. Congress.
Congress.
Congress.
Congress shall make no law.
Make no law respecting an establishment
of religion.
Or prohibiting the
free exercise thereof.
or abridging the freedom
of speech, or the press, or the right
of the people
peaceably
assemble,
and to petition the government
a redress of grievances.
Welcome to the First Amendment and You. I'm your host, Jack Popejoy, and for the next half hour we'll be talking to the man who literally wrote the book. The book is entitled The Four Freedoms of the First Amendment, and he is Dr. Craig R. Smith, the director of the Center for First Amendment Studies and professor at Cal State University, Long Beach. Dr. Smith, I think that to understand the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment specifically, it's important to understand the European monarchies' inexorable attempt to stifle the dissent of their subjects, sometimes literally by shutting them up. True?
Absolutely. The last thing a monarch wanted was people speaking out on issues that could, easily undermine where the monarch wanted to go or where he wanted to lead the country. And so they stifled dissent in all kinds of ways. You couldn't even tell the truth. If it did damage, then you were punished, even if it was something true that you stated. The book, of course, is the Four Freedoms of the First Amendment. What are those four freedoms and why do they need protecting? Well, the first one is freedom of the press. The second one is freedom of speech. The third one is freedom of religion in various forms. And the last one is the right to gather, assemble, and petition the government. We protected those because of the role they played in our revolution. Free press allowed distribution of certain speeches that would have been seen otherwise. For example, when Patrick Henry gave his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, it was transmitted by underground newspapers. When they read the speech in Boston, they formed the Sons of Liberty. And that, of course, then led to the Boston Tea Party, and so it fomented revolution. So press was protected so that people could communicate and correct government when the government was wrong. Obviously, the same thing is true of speech. It needs to be protected if we're going to speak out. They also felt very strongly about freedom of religion, and the reason was that different colonies had been formed by different religions. The Quakers came into Pennsylvania, the Puritans came into Massachusetts, the Catholics came into Maryland. And so there was a very strong desire that everybody could believe and have freedom of conscience on their own. And then, of course, the right to assemble and petition the government for grievances was very important so that Congress would know what it had to do and how it was performing. People forget now because we don't do it as often, but petitions were used, particularly by women's groups during the abolition movement, to try and get rid of slavery. These petitions were sent to Congress, and then John Quincy Adams, who was an ex-president and a member of the House, would read these petitions out on the floor of the House and kind of prick the consciences of Southern senators and congressmen with these petitions and what they said. Of course, as you know, and I hope most other people who have had any kind of education in the United States know, the First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law, restricting the freedoms that you outline in your book. But what about acts of government that are not passed by Congress, that don't begin that way? Executive order, court decisions, state legislatures, for example, local customs such as, well, maybe shunning people with red hair, or Hooters restaurants having restrictions on who they might hire that have nothing to do with any of the freedoms you were just talking about. None involve Congress making a law. That's a very good question. And what has happened is when it comes to the federal government, the First Amendment applied to the federal government. It did not apply to the states. It was only applied against the states through the 14th Amendment and much later than when it was passed. The First Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1791. The 14th Amendment was passed right after the Civil War, and then the First Amendment was applied to the states. Now, in terms of executive orders and that kind of thing, the courts have ruled that what the founders meant when they said Congress shall make no law is that the federal government shall have no laws that prohibit freedom of speech, freedom of press, religious conscience. And so that's how they've gotten around that problem. When you talk about freedom of religion, what if my religion says that I should smoke marijuana or sacrifice black cats or try to convince other people of my beliefs? Or if my belief is that abortion should not be allowed in this country, court-ordered executions or murder, if I believe those things, what about the freedom of religion under those
disparate ideas that not everybody agrees on.
The Supreme Court has ruled quite consistently that there is a difference between action and belief. You can believe what you want. You can believe that every cat on the street should be killed. But if it's against the law to go out and start shooting cats, you're not free to do that. So the separation that's been made is between belief and action. If the state passes a law that you can't smoke marijuana, but it's part of your religion, the Supreme Court has come down on the side of the state, saying that they have a government interest that's compelling and it trumps the First Amendment action, but not belief. So you can continue to believe whatever you want, but you can't act in a way that violates a state law or a federal law.
Of course, there's some issue with the freedom of speech as well. The most famous example, perhaps, yelling fire in a crowded theater. But what if I want to put a sign on my front lawn that says, my neighbor is a child molester, or worse yet, a libertarian, or something like that?
Well, then you get into questions of libel and slander. Libel, as you know, is when you write something bad about someone that isn't true and does them harm. So if you put up a sign in your front yard that said your neighbor was a child molester and that's not true, and it damages their reputation, which it would, he can take you to court, and in a civil court you'd have to pay damages. Slander is when you say something defamatory about somebody rather than writing it down. And that tends to be a little harder to prove, but if there are witnesses and I can prove you said something about me that's not true and was damaging, then I can sue you. If it was true, that's your defense.
As for the freedom to assemble and to express grievances, for example, this would seem to make it illegal to do something that's happened here in Southern California, which is the Los Angeles city attorney, in fact, a couple of city attorneys, have gotten injunctions against gang members assembling and carrying out or even discussing gang activities. Doesn't that fly in the face of the freedom to assemble? I
think that that's going to be an interesting court case. Because remember, the only way that you can get around the First Amendment is if you have a compelling government interest that you're advancing. So you can't give military secrets away and say, well, that's my free speech right. There's a compelling government interest to protect our military secrets. What the city attorneys of Los Angeles will argue is they have a compelling government interest to keep gangs from assembling because of the damage the gangs do when they assemble. And the courts are going to have to sort those things out. It's called a balancing case, when you balance one interest against another. So on the one hand, we have the interest in free speech that we always try to protect. On the other hand, we have a compelling government interest to protect the lives of people who live around gangs.
To step back for a moment then to look at the larger picture once more, you were talking in the beginning about the milieu of the colonists fleeing Europe for various reasons. They had all kinds of issues, as you point out, of right of assembly, of grievance, of speech, of conscience or religion.
Right.
If these were so important, and these were the reasons why these people left the European continent, their homeland, to come here to form a new one and to form the colonies, why weren't these freedoms actually in the original Constitution? Why did they have to be amendments?
That's a very good point. Yeah, the Constitution was written in 1788 and ratified by the states in 1789. And when they first wrote the Constitution, and even James Madison was of this opinion, he and Hamilton, who wrote most of the Federalist Papers along with John Jay, believed that if you put specific rights into the Constitution and you leave something out, the implication is that that's not a right. So they said, we'll leave them all out, and we'll write the Constitution in such a way that it says the Congress and the President and the Supreme Court can only do these things and nothing else. And so they thought that would work, that all of these rights would be preserved by the states, because the states at that point, in 1789, all had constitutions that did have bills of rights in them. So states' rights, they thought, would protect free speech and free press and freedom of religion. It didn't take very long in the ratification process before Massachusetts, for one, and Virginia, for another, said, we're only going to ratify on the condition that a Bill of Rights be put into the Constitution. And Thomas Jefferson was the leader of that movement. And so they ratified the Constitution on the condition that amendments would be submitted to Congress. And Madison was converted by Jefferson to that position. 200 proposals poured into Congress for amendments, and they eventually boiled them down to 12. And 12 were put out to the states for approval, 2 were rejected, and 10 were approved, and those are the Bill of Rights.
If I understand what you've just said then, the Constitution is that which all of the colonies could agree on, and the amendments were those things that they had to vote on later.
Yes. Just as they ratified the Constitution, they had to ratify the amendments. So you had to get the House to ratify the amendments, the Senate to ratify the amendments, then it went out to the states and they ratified the amendments. And that was completed on December 15th, 1791, when Virginia became the necessary vote to put the Bill of Rights into the Constitution.
You mentioned a moment ago, I believe, the Federalist Papers. And in fact, the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist debate was really one of the driving forces behind this entire system of putting together first a Declaration of Independence, and then a Constitution, and then the institution of the first few amendments. Could you discuss that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. The Federalist Party was for a strong federal government. The Articles of Confederation, which preceded our Constitution, had failed. There were disputes between the states that they hadn't been able to work out. Virginia and Maryland claimed all the oysters in the Potomac River, and they couldn't sort that out. The states refused to pay taxes into the federal government. So they held a constitutional convention and decided, rather than amend the Articles of Confederation, they threw them out and they wrote a new constitution. And then they had to debate whether you should vote for that. And the Federalists were in favor of the new Constitution, which strengthened the federal government, and they were led by Hamilton and Washington and those founders. They were opposed by people like Thomas Jefferson, who believed in states' rights and felt that the Constitution might be a little too strong. Patrick Henry was virulently opposed to the Constitution as it was written. He wanted a Bill of Rights in it. And so they eventually did pass the Constitution, but it was with that provision that very soon after a Bill of Rights would be provided and added to it.
Lest anyone think that the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist discussion is an arcane and already decided history. Of course, it's very much alive today. We have things, for example, the notion of whether abortion should be a states' rights issue, California's medical marijuana laws.
Right.
If you want to look across the globe, you've got Iraq, where they're going through the same kinds of debate over a confederation or a national government of unity, over things like oil rights and things like that. This is very much a living issue for Americans today.
Oh, absolutely, and we didn't work it out. Once we ratified the Bill of Rights, we still had the big problem with slavery. Southern states insisted that that was a state's right. They were led by John C. Calhoun, the senator from South Carolina, who was Vice President of the United States at one point. And we didn't sort it out. The United States didn't become a singular noun until after the Civil War. People said the United States are our country, instead of the United States is our country. So we had to fight a civil war. 500,000 people had to lose their lives before we got it straight as to how much power the federal government would have and how much power the states would have. And it keeps evolving. Obviously, under the New Deal, where we had the Depression, a severe crisis, there were further consolidations and strengthening of the federal government over the states. And the Supreme Court, under Earl Warren, also added federal restrictions to the states and made them comply with them. So this is an evolving thing that continues to this day.
You know, that's a fascinating thing that you just brought up that maybe a lot of people don't think about all the time, because growing up in this country, for example, we call ourselves, as you point out, the United States of America. Other countries like Bolivia, France, I started to say Russia, but of course that is the other perhaps example that runs alongside ours. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republic is the only other name of a country that I can think of that sounds like a confederation.
That's right. And you know, the founders were very strong about that. They believed that all powers, as the Constitution says, all powers are reserved to the states that aren't clearly spelled out here in this Constitution. And so we're still fighting this battle. You may remember under Ronald Reagan, he said he was a federalist, meaning he believed that the states were a confederation and that we ought to be pushing more power back to the states instead of the other way around.